They told me the overnight custodial shift at Meridian Research Laboratories would be straightforward. Mop floors, empty trash, maintain basic security protocols. What they didn't tell me was why the previous night janitor resigned without notice after working there for 6 years. What they didn't mention was the section of the building I'd never be allowed to clean. If you enjoy stories about places where normal rules don't apply, you might want to stick around. This one gets stranger by the minute. The interview happened on a Thursday afternoon in October. I'd been out of work since my construction company folded in August, when the main contractor we worked for decided to restructure their subcontractor agreements. 18 months of steady work, gone overnight. The unemployment checks weren't covering rent, and my landlord had already extended my deadline twice. Sandra, my ex-wife, had stopped asking if I needed help with anything, which meant she'd given up on me entirely. I sat across from Helen Reeves, Human Resources Director, in a conference room that smelled like coffee and industrial carpet. She was probably 50, gray hair pulled back, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. The kind of professional competence that made you feel like you should have worn a better shirt. Marcus, right? She glanced at my application. Construction background, some maintenance experience. The position is nights, Sunday through Thursday, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. $32 an hour. Health benefits after 90 days. I try not to look too eager. 32 an hour was more than I'd made swinging a hammer, and night work meant fewer people around to judge the fact that I was 41 and cleaning up after scientists. The facility has specific protocols, Helen continued, pulling out a folder. Security clearance requirements, restricted areas, standard confidentiality agreements. Nothing unusual for a research environment. She slid a packet across the table. The cover page read Meridian Research Laboratories, Custodial Services Handbook in bold letters. Below that, in smaller text, revised October 2023, Level 3 clearance required. Level 3. I asked. Background check, drug screening, basic security orientation. The lab handles government contracts, so there's more paperwork than usual. But the pay reflects that. I flipped through the first few pages. Standard stuff about uniform requirements, time tracking, emergency procedures. Then I reached a section titled Restricted Access Protocols, and the language got more specific. Sublevel 2 is off-limits to custodial staff, Helen said, watching me read. Research in progress, sensitive equipment. You'll have access cards for the main building, but certain areas will remain locked. That seemed reasonable. Every place I'd worked had areas where regular employees couldn't go. The folder contained badge photos, contact information for security supervisors, maps of the building layout with colored zones marking different access levels. When would I start? I asked. Tonight, if you're interested. The previous custodian left suddenly, and we need coverage. I signed the paperwork in the parking lot, using the hood of my truck as a desk. The setting sun reflected off the glass front of the Meridian building, a 5-story structure of steel and tinted windows that looked like every other research facility in the industrial district. Clean lines, unmarked entrance, the kind of place that could house anything from pharmaceutical development to defense contracting. My first night started at 11 p.m. sharp. Helen met me in the lobby with Thomas Chun, the night security supervisor. Thomas was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with the precise movements of someone who took his job seriously. Marcus, right? Helen mentioned you'd be starting tonight. Thomas handed me a security badge and a ring of keys. Let me show you around before the shift gets busy. The lobby was standard corporate design. Polished floors, abstract artwork, a reception desk with computers covered by privacy screens. Thomas badged us through a security door, and we walked down a hallway lined with office spaces and conference rooms. Main floor is administrative, Thomas explained. Marketing, Human resources, accounting. Pretty standard cleanup routine. Second and third floors are active research labs, so you'll need to follow contamination protocols. He handed me a laminated card with step-by-step instructions for cleaning laboratory spaces. Specific chemicals for different surfaces, disposal procedures for various types of waste, protocols for handling equipment. Fourth floor is archives and data storage. Less mess, but more security cameras. Thomas pointed to a small dome in the ceiling corner. Everything's recorded, but nobody's watching unless there's an incident. We took the elevator to the second floor. The hallways here felt different. Brighter lighting, sealed doors with card readers, signs warning about authorized personnel only. Through the small windows and some doors, I could see laboratory benches, equipment I didn't recognize, workstations with multiple computer monitors. Scientists work weird hours, Thomas said. Don't be surprised if you encounter people here at 2 in the morning. They're focused on their work, not particularly social. Most of them won't even notice you're there. We walked past a series of labs, each marked with numbers and letters I assumed were some kind of classification system. Lab 2A through Lab 2H, then a section marked collaboration space, then Lab 2J through Lab 2M. Third floor is similar layout. Thomas continued as we reached the elevator. Fourth floor you can access with your badge, but stick to the areas marked in green on your map. The elevator had buttons for floors 1 through 4, plus 2 additional buttons marked SL1 and SL2. Both had card readers next to them. Sublevels. I asked. SL1 is building maintenance. Utilities, HVAC systems, electrical panels. You'll need to go down there occasionally for supply storage. SL2 is restricted. Your badge won't work, and you don't need to worry about it. Thomas pressed SL1, and the elevator descended past the ground floor. When the doors opened, I saw a basement level with concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, and the mechanical equipment you'd expect in any large building. Water heaters, electrical panels, ventilation systems, storage areas lined with metal shelving. Supply closet is there. Thomas pointed to a door marked custodial. Cleaning chemicals, equipment, spare uniforms. Everything's inventoried, so log what you take. We rode back to the main floor. Thomas walked me to a desk in the security office, a small room with multiple monitors showing camera feeds from different parts of the building. You'll check in here at the start and end of each shift, he said, handing me a clipboard. Sign in, note any incidents or maintenance issues, sign out when you leave. Questions? I looked at the clipboard. Standard time tracking, nothing complicated. The monitors showed empty hallways, darkened offices, a few laboratories with equipment still running, but no people visible. Seems straightforward, I said. It is. Just follow the protocols, stay out of restricted areas, and don't touch anything that looks like scientific equipment. The researchers are particular about their work. Thomas left me with a cart loaded with cleaning supplies and a printed schedule showing which areas to clean each night. Monday was main floor offices. Tuesday was second floor labs. Wednesday was third floor labs. Thursday was fourth floor archives. Friday was deep cleaning and maintenance tasks. Tonight was Monday, so I started with the administrative offices. Standard work. Empty trash cans, vacuum carpets, dust surfaces, clean windows. The kind of routine I could do without thinking about much. The building felt different at night than during my afternoon interview. Quieter, but not silent. HVAC systems running, computers humming, the occasional electronic beep from some piece of equipment. Normal building sounds, but more noticeable when you're alone. I finished the main floor around 1 a.m. and decided to take a break. The security office had a small break room with a coffee machine, microwave, and a table where I could sit for a few minutes. Thomas was doing his rounds, so I had the area to myself. Have you ever worked somewhere that felt completely normal during the day, but somehow different at night? There's something about empty buildings that changes the atmosphere entirely. That's when I first heard it. A sound like typing, coming from somewhere above me. Steady, rhythmic, the sound of fingers on a keyboard. But according to Thomas, most of the research staff worked normal hours, and it was past 1 in the morning. I walked back to the main lobby and looked up at the second floor. Most of the lights were off, but I could see illumination coming from one of the laboratory areas. Someone working late, like Thomas had mentioned. Nothing unusual about that. I went back to work, cleaning the remaining first floor areas. Conference rooms, restrooms, the lobby itself. By 3 a.m., I'd finished everything on my list for the night. I was ahead of schedule, which felt good. Maybe this job would work out better than I'd expected. I checked back in with the security office to log my completed tasks. Thomas had returned from his rounds and was reviewing something on his computer. "How'd the first night go?" he asked. "Good. Finished everything on the list. Heard someone working upstairs around 1 a.m. Thomas glanced at his monitors, checking the camera feeds from the second floor. Lab 2F, Dr. Sarah Martinez. She's been pulling long hours on some project deadline. You'll get used to seeing lights on at weird hours. I nodded and signed out on the clipboard. My shift ended at 7 a.m., which meant I had 4 hours to kill until morning. Not enough time to go home and sleep properly, but enough time to grab breakfast and figure out my new schedule. The parking lot was empty except for my truck and 2 other cars, presumably belonging to Thomas and Dr. Martinez. The October air was cold, with that sharp clarity that comes just before dawn. I sat in my truck for a minute, letting the heater warm up, feeling satisfied about the work. $32 an hour for basic custodial work. Health benefits after 90 days. A schedule that would let me look for additional day work if I needed to. Maybe things were finally turning around. Tuesday night, I arrived at 10:50 and badged into the building through the main entrance. Thomas was already in the security office, reviewing what looked like incident reports. "Evening, Marcus. How are you settling in?" "Good. Ready to tackle the second floor tonight." Thomas handed me the same cart of supplies, but this time he also gave me a small device that looked like a pager. "Dosimeter," he explained. "Some of the research involves low-level radiation. Nothing dangerous, but safety regulations require monitoring. Clip it to your shirt. Return it at the end of your shift." I attached the device to my uniform pocket. It had a small digital display showing zeros, which I assumed meant no radiation detected. "Anything special I need to know about the lab areas?" "Same protocols as yesterday. Don't touch equipment. Don't move anything on the workbenches. Dispose of waste according to the color-coded system. The researchers leave notes if they have specific requests." I took the elevator to the second floor and started with Lab 2A. The door was propped open, and the workspace was much more complex than I'd expected. Multiple computer workstations, equipment I couldn't identify, workbenches covered with instruments, cables, and devices that hummed quietly even when not actively in use. The trash cans contained mostly paper products, printouts, notebooks, coffee cups. But there were also disposal containers labeled with warning symbols I didn't recognize. Biological waste, chemical waste, radioactive materials. I followed the protocols exactly, double-checking the color coding before disposing of anything. Lab 2B was similar, but larger. More workstations, more equipment, and what looked like a sealed chamber in the center of the room with thick glass windows and mechanical arms for manipulating objects inside. The dosimeter on my shirt clicked occasionally, and the display showed small numbers that changed as I moved around the room. I cleaned methodically, working my way down the hallway. Lab 2C, Lab 2D, Lab 2E. Each space had its own personality, some organized and clinical, others cluttered with the controlled chaos of active research. but all of them had the same underlying feeling of precision and purpose. When I reached Lab 2F, I recognized it as the space where I'd seen lights on the previous night. Dr. Martinez's lab. The door was closed, but I could see through the window that the workspace was active. Computer monitors displaying scrolling data, equipment with blinking status lights, and what appeared to be some kind of experimental setup involving a metal chamber connected to multiple instruments. I knocked gently on the door, not wanting to startle anyone inside. No response. I tried the handle, and the door opened easily. The lab was empty, but clearly in use. Coffee cups still warm, computer screens showing active processes, notebooks open to pages covered with handwritten calculations. Wherever Dr. Martinez had gone, she'd stepped away recently and expected to return soon. I cleaned quickly, not wanting to interfere with whatever work was in progress. The trash was minimal, just a few coffee cups and some paper towels. But as I was emptying the waste basket, I noticed something odd. One of the computer monitors displayed what looked like a live video feed. Not security cameras from the building, but footage of an outdoor area I didn't recognize. Rolling hills, scattered trees, overcast sky. The timestamp in the corner showed the current date and time, but the landscape didn't look like anything in our area. I finished cleaning and moved on to the next lab, but the image stayed in my mind. It had looked too real to be stock footage or a screensaver, but too unfamiliar to be local terrain. Lab 2G was locked, which wasn't unusual. Several of the labs required specific access cards, and my custodial badge only opened areas designated for cleaning. I made a note to ask Thomas about which spaces I should skip. The rest of the second floor followed the same pattern. Clinical laboratories filled with sophisticated equipment, most of it running automated processes that continued even when no one was present. By 4 a.m., I completed everything accessible, and my dosimeter had recorded only minor radiation exposure well within safety limits. I returned to the security office to check out. Thomas was monitoring something on his computer that required his full attention, so I signed the clipboard quietly and left the dosimeter on his desk. Wednesday night brought the third-floor laboratories, which were laid out similarly to the second floor, but felt somehow different. More specialized, more isolated. Several of the labs had additional security features, card readers, keypad locks, even a few with biometric scanners. Third floor handles more sensitive research, Thomas explained when I asked about the extra security. Federal contracts, classified projects. Your badge will get you into the areas you need to clean, but don't try doors that don't open. The accessible labs were cleaner than the second floor, with less evidence of active work and more emphasis on documentation and analysis. Lots of computers, fewer hands-on experiments, more printouts and reports. But Lab 3E gave me pause. Like Lab 2F, it was unlocked but empty when I arrived. The workspace contained similar equipment, computers, monitoring devices, and what appeared to be another sealed chamber for manipulating objects remotely. But this chamber was larger, and the control systems more sophisticated. The computer monitors here showed multiple feeds of outdoor locations, each with different landscapes and lighting conditions. Mountain terrain, desert areas, coastal regions, forest environments. All with current timestamps, all appearing to show live footage. I studied the screens more carefully than I had on the second floor. The locations were definitely real. I could see weather patterns, moving clouds, vegetation swaying in wind. But the geographical diversity didn't make sense. One screen showed what looked like tropical mountains, another displayed snow-covered plains, a third showed desert landscape with harsh afternoon sun. Different climate zones, all supposedly filmed at the same time on the same date. If you're finding this as puzzling as I was, a quick like helps more people discover these kinds of stories. I finished cleaning Lab 3E and continued down the hallway, but my mind kept returning to those video feeds. Were they recording from weather stations in different parts of the world? Some kind of environmental monitoring project? It would explain the federal contracts and security measures. Thursday night was archives and data storage on the fourth floor. Much easier work than the laboratories, primarily offices filled with filing cabinets, computer servers, and document storage areas. Less equipment to work around, fewer specialized disposal requirements. But the fourth floor had its own peculiarities. Many of the offices contained maps and geographical surveys from locations I couldn't identify. Topographical charts, satellite imagery, geological surveys, all marked with coordinate systems that didn't correspond to any mapping system I recognized. One office labeled Field Operations contained what appeared to be expedition equipment. Camping gear, scientific instruments, communication devices, and clothing suitable for various climate conditions. Everything was organized and maintained as if ready for immediate deployment. I was cleaning this office when I found the photographs. They were in a filing cabinet marked Site Documentation, in folders labeled with alphanumeric codes. Each folder contained dozens of photographs showing outdoor locations that looked like the landscapes I'd seen on the computer monitors. But these were high-resolution images, clearly taken by researchers in the field. The photographs showed teams of people in scientific gear conducting various activities, setting up equipment, taking measurements, collecting samples. Normal field work, except for one detail that made me look more carefully. The backgrounds in many of the photographs showed environmental features that shouldn't exist together. Desert plants growing next to temperate forest species. Rock formations characteristic of different geological periods in the same frame. Weather conditions that didn't match the terrain. I photographed several of the images with my phone, not sure why, but feeling like I needed some record of what I was seeing. The quality wasn't great, but clear enough to show the geographical inconsistencies that had caught my attention. Friday night was supposed to be maintenance tasks and deep cleaning, but when I arrived, Helen Reeves was waiting in the lobby with Thomas and another man I didn't recognize. The stranger was tall, maybe 60, wearing a suit that looked expensive even under the fluorescent lobby lighting. "Marcus, this is Dr. William Chen from our Research Coordination Department," Helen said. "He has some additional protocols to discuss with you." Dr. Chen extended his hand. His grip was firm, professional, but his eyes studied my face in a way that made me slightly uncomfortable. "Marcus, I understand you've been doing excellent work this week. Thomas tells me you follow instructions precisely and respect the security requirements." "Yes, sir. Just trying to do the job right." "That's exactly what we need to hear." Dr. Chen pulled out a tablet and scrolled through what appeared to be security reports. "Your access has been expanded for tonight. You'll be able to clean additional areas that weren't included in your initial assignment." Thomas handed me a different badge, this one marked with a blue stripe instead of the green stripe on my regular custodial badge. The magnetic strip looked identical, but there were additional markings I didn't recognize. "This badge will give you access to SL2, Dr. Chen explained. "The sublevel areas that were previously restricted. There's been a change in security classification for some of the research conducted down there." I looked at Helen, wondering if this was normal. She nodded reassuringly. "Additional compensation, of course. $45 an hour for any work performed in sublevel areas. And a confidentiality bonus of $500 upon completion of tonight's assignment." $45 an hour was more money than I'd made at any job in my life. $500 bonus meant I could catch up on rent and maybe have something left over. But the sudden change in access and the formal way they were presenting this made me cautious. "What kind of cleaning work?" I asked. "Standard custodial procedures. The area has been in use for several weeks while undergoing security review. Basic cleaning, waste disposal, equipment maintenance. Nothing different from what you've been doing on the upper floors. Dr. Chun handed me a folder similar to the one Helen had given me on my first day, but thicker and marked with additional security warnings. These are the specific protocols for sublevel work. Slightly more detailed than the standard procedures, but nothing you can't handle. I flipped through the first few pages. More complex disposal categories, additional safety equipment requirements, more detailed logging procedures. But the basic work seemed similar to what I'd been doing all week. How often would I be working down there? Tonight only, Helen said. This is a one-time cleaning assignment while the area transitions between research projects. Thomas checked his watch. We should get started. The work needs to be completed before morning shift arrives. I followed them to the elevator, using the new badge to access SL2. The elevator descended past the basement level I'd visited earlier, past SL1, and stopped at a floor I didn't know existed. When the doors opened, I was looking at a hallway that resembled the upper laboratory levels, but felt significantly different. The lighting was brighter, almost harsh. The walls were painted institutional white instead of the warmer colors used above ground. And there was a smell I couldn't identify, not unpleasant, but distinctly chemical and clinical. The area is divided into 6 sections, Dr. Chin explained, consulting his tablet. Each section requires specific cleaning protocols outlined in your folder. Estimated completion time is 4 to 5 hours, which should give you adequate time before your shift ends. He handed me a different type of dosimeter, larger than the one I'd used upstairs and equipped with an audible alarm system. Some of the research involves higher energy processes than what you've encountered on the upper floors. Nothing dangerous if you follow the protocols, but we monitor more carefully. Thomas showed me to a supply area stocked with cleaning materials and safety equipment. Heavy-duty cleaning chemicals, specialized disposal containers, protective clothing including full-face respirators. Section 1 is standard laboratory cleaning, Thomas said, pointing down the hallway. Sections 2 and 3 require the protective equipment. Sections 4, 5, and 6 are locked for tonight, so you don't need to worry about them. Dr. Chun checked his tablet again. Questions? I looked at the folder of protocols, the safety equipment, the institutional hallway stretching ahead of me. Everything felt more serious than the work I'd been doing upstairs, but also more lucrative. $45 an hour plus a $500 bonus would solve my immediate financial problems and give me breathing room to plan for the future. I think I'm ready, I said. Excellent. We'll check on your progress in a few hours. Dr. Chun and Helen walked back to the elevator, leaving me alone with Thomas. Any advice? I asked. Thomas looked around the hallway, then back at me. Follow the protocols exactly. Don't improvise. If something seems wrong, call me immediately. He handed me a radio. I'll be monitoring from upstairs. The elevator doors closed, and I was alone on SL2. Section 1 looked like a larger version of the laboratories I'd been cleaning all week. More equipment, more workstations, more sophisticated instrumentation, but fundamentally similar. I started with the same routine I'd established upstairs: trash collection, surface cleaning, floor maintenance. But as I worked, I noticed details that hadn't been present in the upper laboratories. The equipment here was connected to systems I couldn't see, with cables and pipes running through walls and ceilings to destinations unknown. The computer workstations were larger and more powerful, with multiple monitors displaying data streams that updated continuously even though no one was present. Most significantly, the workbenches contained materials and instruments that looked more advanced than anything I'd encountered in the building so far. Devices that hummed with energy, containers holding substances that seemed to move or shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, and monitoring equipment that tracked processes I couldn't understand. The dosimeter clipped to my shirt clicked more frequently than it had upstairs, and the digital display showed numbers that gradually increased as I moved around the room. Still within the safety ranges outlined in my protocols, but noticeably higher than the minimal readings I'd recorded on the upper floors. I finished Section 1 around 2 a.m. and moved to Section 2, which required the protective equipment Thomas had shown me. I put on the respirator, protective clothing, and additional monitoring devices before entering. Section 2 was divided into smaller rooms, each containing experimental setups that were clearly more complex and sophisticated than anything I'd seen upstairs. Sealed chambers, remote manipulation equipment, monitoring systems that tracked multiple variables simultaneously. But what caught my attention were the viewing windows. Each room had large windows that looked into adjacent spaces, and those spaces contained what appeared to be environmental chambers. Not simple laboratory equipment, but full-scale recreations of outdoor environments. I could see through the windows into spaces that contained different types of terrain, different lighting conditions, different atmospheric effects. One chamber appeared to contain a section of desert landscape, complete with sand, rocks, and what looked like natural sunlight, even though we were underground. Another showed temperate forest environment with soil, vegetation, and what appeared to be weather patterns including wind and precipitation. If you're as curious as I was about what I was seeing, subscribing helps me share more stories like this one. I cleaned methodically, trying not to stare too obviously at the environmental chambers, but finding it difficult to focus on mundane tasks when I was surrounded by what appeared to be artificial ecosystems operating underground in the middle of the night. The protocols for Section 2 included specific instructions for handling waste from the environmental chambers. Soil samples, plant materials, water samples, all requiring separate disposal categories and special handling procedures. I followed the instructions precisely, but the whole time I was wondering what kind of research required this level of environmental simulation. Section 3 was similar to Section 2, but larger, with more environmental chambers and more sophisticated monitoring equipment. The chambers here showed landscape types I'd seen in the photographs upstairs, the same geographical inconsistencies, the same impossible combinations of terrain and climate features. But these weren't photographs. These were functioning environments, complete with weather patterns, plant life, and what appeared to be naturally occurring processes happening in real time underground. I was cleaning around a chamber that appeared to contain mountain terrain when I noticed something that made me stop and look more carefully. Through the viewing window, I could see movement in the simulated environment, not wind or weather effects, but something that looked like it might be living creatures moving across the artificial landscape. The movement was subtle and occurred at the edge of my peripheral vision, but consistent enough that I was certain something was happening inside the environmental chamber. The protocols didn't mention anything about living specimens, and I wasn't sure if what I was seeing was part of the research or some kind of equipment malfunction. I made a note to mention it to Thomas when I checked in and continued with the cleaning routine. But as I worked through Section 3, I noticed similar movement in several other environmental chambers. Brief, subtle, but definitely present. By 4 a.m., I'd completed the 3 sections Dr. Chun had assigned to me. The work had been more complex than standard custodial duties, but not unreasonably difficult. The protective equipment was cumbersome, but the safety protocols were clear and straightforward. I returned the specialized cleaning equipment to the supply area and prepared to head back upstairs. The dosimeter showed elevated readings, but still within acceptable ranges, and I felt satisfied with the work I'd completed. I was waiting for the elevator when I heard a sound that made me pause. It was coming from the direction of Section 4, One of the areas Dr. Chun had said was locked for the night. A rhythmic tapping, like someone typing on a keyboard, but with an irregular pattern that suggested human input rather than automated processes. I checked my radio, wondering if I should report the sound to Thomas. But the protocols had been specific about staying in assigned areas, and I didn't want to create problems by investigating sounds from restricted sections. The tapping continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. I waited, listening, but heard only the background hum of ventilation systems and equipment that I'd grown accustomed to throughout the building. The elevator arrived, and I rode back to ground level. Thomas was in the security office, monitoring the camera feeds and completing what appeared to be end-of-shift reports. "How did it go downstairs?" he asked. "Fine. Everything cleaned according to the protocols. I noticed some movement in the environmental chambers. Is that normal?" Thomas looked at his monitors, checking camera feeds from SL2. Movement in the simulated environments. Looked like something moving across the terrain. Maybe animals or automated equipment. Some of the chambers include biological components, Thomas said after a pause. Wildlife, vegetation, natural ecosystem processes. Part of the environmental research. That made sense. If they were studying environmental systems, they would need to include living components to make the simulations accurate and useful. Also heard typing sounds from Section 4 around 4 a.m. I know that area was supposed to be locked. Thomas checked his monitors again, scrolling through several camera feeds. Dr. Martinez was authorized to access that section for equipment retrieval. She's working on a project deadline. I nodded and signed out on the clipboard. The additional compensation would be reflected in my next paycheck, along with the confidentiality bonus Helen had mentioned. $45 an hour plus the bonus meant this single shift had earned me more than a week of construction work. Regular schedule next week? I asked. Standard rotation. Upper floors, normal custodial duties. Thomas paused, then added, "The sublevel work was a special assignment. Probably won't come up again for a while." I drove home feeling more optimistic about my financial situation than I had in months. The work at Meridian was unusual, but not unreasonably difficult. The pay was excellent, and the regular schedule would allow me to plan my budget more effectively than the inconsistent construction work I'd been doing. But as I sat in my apartment that morning, trying to fall asleep after the night shift, I found myself thinking about the environmental chambers and the movement I'd observed. Wildlife made sense in the context of ecosystem research, but the scale and sophistication of the simulations seemed far beyond what I would have expected from a private research laboratory. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photographs I'd taken of the field documentation from the 4th floor. In daylight, the geographical inconsistencies were even more obvious. Desert and forest vegetation in the same frame, geological formations from different eras, weather patterns that didn't match the terrain. Either Meridian was conducting research at a scale and complexity I couldn't fully understand, or I was missing some crucial piece of information about what I'd observed. Have you ever worked somewhere that gradually revealed itself to be much more complex than you initially understood? I'd love to hear your experiences. The following Monday, I returned to the standard schedule. Main floor administrative offices, routine custodial work, normal procedures. After the intensity and complexity of the sublevel assignment, the regular duties felt almost simple by comparison. But I found myself paying more attention to details I might have overlooked during my first week. Conversations I overheard, documents left on desks, equipment and materials that suggested the scope of research being conducted at Meridian. During my break around 2 a.m., I was in the security office when Dr. Martinez walked through the lobby. She looked exhausted, carrying a briefcase and wearing the same clothes I'd seen her in on previous nights. "Working late again?" Thomas asked as she badged through the security door. Project deadline moved up, she replied without stopping. Need to finish the analysis before Wednesday. After she disappeared into the elevator, Thomas shook his head. Federal contracts. They change requirements without notice, then expect researchers to adapt overnight. What kind of analysis? I asked. Thomas looked at his monitors, checking the feeds from the upper floors. Environmental impact studies. Climate modeling. Government wants to understand how different environmental conditions affect various processes. That aligned with what I'd observed in the sub-level environmental chambers. Climate modeling would require detailed simulations of different environmental conditions, which would explain the sophisticated equipment and the variety of simulated ecosystems I'd seen. Tuesday night, I was cleaning the second-floor laboratories when I encountered Dr. Martinez in Lab 2F. She was working at one of the computer workstations, analyzing data from what appeared to be multiple simultaneous experiments. Sorry to interrupt, I said. Can I clean around your work area? She looked up from her computer, blinking as if she'd forgotten that other people existed. Oh, right. The custodial staff. Yes, go ahead. Just don't move anything on the workbenches. I cleaned quietly while she worked, but I couldn't help noticing the data displayed on her monitors. Multiple environmental readings, temperature, humidity, atmospheric composition, soil chemistry, being tracked simultaneously across what appeared to be different geographical locations. Excuse me, she said suddenly. You're the new night custodian, right? Marcus? Yes, ma'am. Have you noticed anything unusual during your work? Sounds, equipment behaving differently, anything out of the ordinary? The question surprised me. Not really. Everything seems to operate pretty normally, even at night. She studied my face for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to say more. The building has been experiencing some minor technical issues lately. Power fluctuations, equipment calibration problems. Nothing dangerous, but we're trying to track down the source. I haven't noticed any power issues, I said honestly. Good. If you do notice anything, lights flickering, equipment behaving strangely, unusual sounds, would you mind reporting it? We're trying to maintain precise environmental conditions for the research, and any interference could affect our results. I agreed to watch for technical problems and continued cleaning. But as I worked, I wondered if the technical issues she mentioned were related to the sophisticated equipment I'd observed in the sublevel chambers. Operating artificial ecosystems would require enormous amounts of power and precise environmental control systems. Wednesday night brought me back to the third-floor laboratories, where I encountered more evidence of the scope and complexity of Meridian's research activities. The accessible labs contained equipment for analyzing soil samples, atmospheric gas measurements, plant specimens, and water chemistry from multiple sources. But what caught my attention were the reports and documentation I saw on various desks and workstations. References to Site 7, Site 12, Site 23, and other numbered locations. Geographical coordinates that didn't correspond to local areas. Supply requisitions for equipment suitable for extreme weather conditions and remote field work. It appeared that Meridian was conducting active research at multiple field sites, probably in various climate zones and geographical regions. That would explain the diversity of environmental data I'd observed and the need for sophisticated simulation equipment to analyze conditions from locations around the world. Thursday night on the fourth-floor archives, I found additional documentation that supported this theory. Shipping manifests for equipment sent to remote locations. Personnel records for researchers assigned to temporary field work. Communication logs with field teams reporting data from various sites. The scope of Meridian's operations was much larger than I'd initially understood. They weren't just analyzing environmental conditions. They were actively conducting research at field sites around the world and using the laboratory facilities to process and analyze data collected from remote locations. Friday brought me back to maintenance duties and deep cleaning, but this time without the special assignment to sublevel areas. I completed the regular tasks efficiently, but found myself wondering about the environmental chambers I'd seen the previous week and whether the research conducted down there was connected to the field sites referenced in the fourth floor documentation. My second week at Meridian followed the same pattern, but with a growing understanding of the complexity and scale of the research being conducted. I was cleaning around sophisticated equipment used to analyze environmental samples, process data from remote field teams, and simulate environmental conditions with remarkable precision. But it was during my third week that I began to notice discrepancies that made me question my understanding of what I'd observed. I was cleaning Lab 3E on a Wednesday night when I noticed that the computer monitors displaying multiple environmental feeds showed landscapes that were unmistakably familiar. Not because I'd seen them in person, but because I'd seen them in the sublevel environmental chambers the week before. The landscapes on the monitors weren't feeds from remote field sites. They were real-time views of the artificial environments I'd cleaned in sections 2 and 3 of SL2. The desert terrain, the forest ecosystem, the mountain landscape. All of them were being monitored from the third-floor laboratory as if they were actual field locations. I stopped cleaning and studied the monitors more carefully. Each feed showed detailed environmental data, temperature, humidity, atmospheric composition, soil chemistry, updating in real time. But these were readings from the underground chambers, not from field sites around the world. The timestamps on each feed showed the current date and time, but the geographical coordinates displayed didn't correspond to our location. Instead, they showed latitude and longitude readings that would place these environments in different parts of the world entirely. I took another photograph with my phone, capturing one of the monitors that showed what I knew was the simulated desert environment from SL2, but labeled with coordinates that would place it somewhere in the southwestern United States. The implications were unsettling. If Meridian was presenting data from their artificial environments as if it came from actual field sites, then either I was misunderstanding something fundamental about their research, or they were engaged in some form of deliberate misrepresentation. I finished cleaning Lab 3E and continued with my routine, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd observed. Were the environmental chambers some kind of testing facility for equipment that would later be deployed to actual field sites? Were they calibration systems for remote monitoring equipment? Or were they being used to generate data that was then presented as coming from real locations? Thursday night on the fourth floor, I looked more carefully at the field operations documentation I'd seen during previous visits. The shipping manifests for equipment sent to remote locations, the personnel records for researchers assigned to field work, the communication logs with field teams. But now I noticed details that hadn't stood out before. The shipping manifest showed equipment being sent to locations, but no records of data or samples being received back from those locations. The personnel records showed researchers assigned to field work, but the assignment durations were unusually short, typically 1 to 3 days rather than the weeks or months I would expect for remote environmental research. The communication logs showed regular contact with field teams, but the messages were brief and technical, focused on equipment status rather than research findings or environmental observations. It looked like Meridian was maintaining a network of remote monitoring stations, but not conducting the kind of intensive field research that would require the sophisticated analysis equipment I'd been cleaning in the laboratories. Friday night, I was completing maintenance tasks when Helen Reeves approached me in the main lobby around 3 a.m. She was carrying the same folder she'd used during my original interview, and her expression suggested this wasn't a casual check-in. "Marcus, Do you have a few minutes to discuss your work performance? Of course. Is there a problem? Not a problem exactly. But we've received some feedback that suggests you might be curious about aspects of our research that go beyond your custodial responsibilities. My stomach tightened. I'd been careful not to interfere with any equipment or research materials, but I had been observing and trying to understand what I was seeing. I've tried to stay focused on the cleaning duties, I said. Dr. Martinez mentioned that you asked questions about the computer displays in her laboratory. Thomas noted that you've been spending time reviewing documentation in the archive areas. Dr. Chun observed that you seemed particularly interested in the environmental chambers during your sublevel assignment. Helen opened her folder and consulted what appeared to be evaluation notes. These observations don't indicate any violation of protocols, but they suggest a level of curiosity that could become problematic. I'm sorry if I've overstepped any boundaries. I was just trying to understand the work environment better. That's understandable, and in many cases, employee curiosity about company operations is positive. But Meridian's research involves federal contracts with specific confidentiality requirements. Even casual observation of certain activities could create legal complications. She handed me a document titled Enhanced Confidentiality Agreement, Amendment to Existing Employment Contract. This amendment addresses the expanded access you've had to various research areas and provides additional compensation in exchange for more restrictive confidentiality requirements. I scanned the document quickly. The language was dense and legal, but the basic terms were clear. Additional compensation of $200 per week in exchange for agreeing not to discuss, document, or investigate any aspects of Meridian's research activities beyond what was necessary to complete assigned custodial duties. The enhanced agreement also includes a provision for periodic sublevel assignments, Helen continued. Similar to your work last week, but on a regular basis. $45 per hour for sublevel work, with monthly confidentiality bonuses. The financial terms were attractive. An additional $200 per week, plus regular sublevel assignments at premium pay rates would provide more financial security than I'd had in years. But the confidentiality restrictions were clearly intended to discourage exactly the kind of observation and curiosity I'd been engaging in. Can I review this overnight and give you an answer tomorrow? Of course. Take your time to consider the terms. I completed my shift and drove home with the amended contract on the passenger seat of my truck. The financial benefits were significant, but I was troubled by the timing of Helen's approach and the specific observations she'd mentioned. Dr. Martinez had asked me to report any unusual technical issues, which suggested she might be concerned about the same discrepancies I'd noticed. But Helen's conversation implied that my curiosity about those discrepancies was problematic rather than helpful. I spent the weekend reviewing the enhanced confidentiality agreement and thinking about what I'd observed during my 3 weeks at Meridian. The environmental chambers, the computer displays showing artificial environments labeled with remote coordinates, the documentation suggesting field operations that didn't align with the laboratory activities I'd witnessed. Either Meridian was conducting legitimate environmental research using methods I didn't fully understand, or they were engaged in activities that required deliberate misrepresentation of their data sources. The enhanced compensation would solve my immediate financial problems and provide long-term stability. But accepting the agreement would require me to ignore questions that seemed increasingly important to answer. Monday night, I returned to work having decided to sign the enhanced confidentiality agreement. The financial benefits outweighed my curiosity about research activities that didn't directly affect my work duties. I would focus on custodial responsibilities and avoid investigating aspects of Meridian's operations that were beyond my scope of employment. Helen was waiting in the lobby with the executed agreement, and a new badge that included additional security clearances. Thank you for your decision, Marcus. Dr. Chun has scheduled your first regular sublevel assignment for Wednesday night. Same procedures as before, but with access to additional sections. She handed me an updated folder of protocols that included procedures for areas I hadn't seen during my initial sublevel work. The work will be more complex than what you handled last week, but the compensation reflects that increased responsibility. Tuesday night, I followed my standard routine on the second-floor laboratories, but with a conscious effort to focus only on custodial duties and avoid the kind of detailed observation that had attracted Helen's attention. But focusing on routine tasks became difficult when I encountered Dr. Martinez in Lab 2F around 2 a.m. She was working frantically at multiple computer workstations, and her stress level was obviously elevated. "Excuse me," she said when she noticed me cleaning nearby. "You're Marcus, right? The custodial staff member who's been working here for a few weeks." "Yes, ma'am." "Have you signed an enhanced confidentiality agreement recently?" The question surprised me. "Yes, just yesterday." She looked around the laboratory, checking to make sure we were alone, then lowered her voice. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that this conversation is not happening." I stopped cleaning and looked at her directly. Her expression was serious and concerned in a way that made me pay attention. "During your sublevel work, did you observe anything that seemed inconsistent with standard environmental research? Equipment that didn't match the stated research objectives, data that didn't align with expected results, procedures that seemed unusual?" I thought about the environmental chambers labeled with remote coordinates, the movement I'd observed in the artificial ecosystems, the documentation that suggested field operations without corresponding data collection activities. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean," I said carefully. "I've been analyzing environmental data for 8 years," Dr. Martinez continued. "The data I'm being asked to process doesn't correspond to any known environmental conditions. The atmospheric readings, soil chemistry, biological markers, they're consistent internally, but they don't match any actual geographical locations." She showed me one of her computer monitors, displaying environmental data similar to what I'd seen during my previous work. These readings supposedly come from a monitoring station in Colorado, but the atmospheric composition includes elements that don't occur naturally at that altitude and latitude. The soil chemistry shows mineral concentrations that would require geological conditions that don't exist in that region. Have you ever been in a situation where someone trusted you with information that made you question everything you thought you knew? I'm curious about your experiences with workplace revelations. I looked at the data on her screen. The readings were detailed and precise, but I didn't have the background to understand the inconsistencies she was describing. "What do you think is causing the discrepancies?" I asked. "I think the data isn't coming from field sites. I think it's being generated artificially, using controlled environmental conditions that simulate various geographical locations, but don't actually correspond to those locations." That aligned with what I'd observed during my sublevel work, sophisticated environmental chambers that could simulate different climate conditions and terrain types. Why would they do that? I don't know, but I've been asked to certify this data as accurate environmental readings from specific geographical coordinates. If I sign off on the analysis, it becomes part of a federal environmental impact study that will influence policy decisions. The implications were significant. If Meridian was generating artificial environmental data and presenting it as readings from actual field sites, they were potentially influencing government policy based on fabricated information. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I need more information before I make any decisions. That's why I'm asking about your sublevel work. Did you observe equipment or procedures that could generate the kind of data I'm being asked to analyze?" I thought about my enhanced confidentiality agreement and the specific warning Helen had given me about discussing research activities. But Dr. Martinez was clearly concerned about the integrity of scientific data that would influence government policy, which seemed more important than employment contract restrictions. I observed environmental simulation chambers that could replicate different climate conditions and terrain types, I said. They appeared to be generating real-time environmental data. How sophisticated were the simulations? Very sophisticated. Complete ecosystems with weather patterns, vegetation, soil conditions. They looked like actual outdoor environments. Dr. Martinez nodded grimly. That would explain the data characteristics I've been seeing. Controlled conditions that can simulate natural environments but produce readings that don't quite match what you'd expect from actual field sites. What's your next step? I need to document what I've observed and decide whether to sign off on the data analysis. But if I refuse to certify the data, I'll probably lose my job. If I do certify it, I'll be participating in what appears to be deliberate misrepresentation of scientific information. She looked at her computer monitors, displaying data streams from multiple supposed field sites. I've been working here for 3 years. I thought we were conducting legitimate environmental research. Finding out that we might be generating fabricated data for government policy decisions is not what I signed up for. I finished cleaning Lab 2F and continued with my routine, but Dr. Martinez's concern stayed with me for the rest of the shift. The sophisticated environmental chambers I'd observed during my sublevel work were apparently being used to generate data that was then presented as coming from actual field sites around the world. Wednesday night brought my second sublevel assignment, with access to additional sections I hadn't seen during my previous work. Helen met me in the lobby with Dr. Chun and Thomas, along with the enhanced safety equipment and protocols I would need for the expanded access. Tonight, you'll be working in sections 1 through 5, Dr. Chun explained. Same basic procedures, but Section 4 and Section 5 contain more sophisticated equipment that requires additional safety precautions. He handed me a more advanced dosimeter and additional protective equipment, including a full environmental suit and independent air supply system. The work in sections 4 and 5 involves exposure to controlled atmospheric conditions that simulate various environmental extremes. Nothing dangerous if you follow the protocols, but requiring more comprehensive protection. I suited up in the enhanced protective equipment and took the elevator down to SL2. The first 3 sections were familiar from my previous sublevel work. Environmental chambers simulating different climate conditions, monitoring equipment, standard custodial procedures. But Section 4 was significantly different. The area contained larger environmental chambers, more sophisticated atmospheric control systems, and what appeared to be equipment for manipulating weather patterns within the simulated environments. I could see through the viewing windows into chambers that contained active weather systems. Rainstorms, snowfall, wind patterns, all occurring in controlled artificial environments. The custodial work required cleaning around equipment that was actively generating these weather patterns. Atmospheric processors, temperature control systems, humidity generators, and devices I couldn't identify that seemed to be creating the meteorological conditions I observed through the viewing windows. Section 5 was even more complex. The environmental chambers here were larger and contained what appeared to be complete ecosystems with multiple interacting environmental variables. Not just terrain and weather, but complex biological processes involving plants, soil chemistry, and what appeared to be animal life. I was cleaning around the monitoring equipment for one of these complex chambers when I noticed something that made me stop and look more carefully. The biological activity I was observing wasn't limited to simple plant life or basic ecosystem processes. There appeared to be more complex organisms moving through the artificial environment in patterns that suggested intelligent behavior. I moved closer to the viewing window and watched for several minutes. The movement patterns were definitely consistent with animal behavior, but the organisms themselves were difficult to see clearly through the atmospheric effects being generated within the chamber. I continued cleaning, but made mental notes about what I was observing. The environmental chambers in Section 5 weren't just simulating climate conditions and terrain features. They were supporting complete ecosystems with complex biological processes that included animal life. The protocols for Section 5 included procedures for handling biological waste that went beyond the plant materials and soil samples I'd encountered in the upper sections. Animal waste, biological specimens, and what appeared to be tissue samples requiring specialized disposal procedures. I completed the custodial work in all 5 sections by 6 a.m., but spent the drive home thinking about the scope and sophistication of what I'd observed. Meridian wasn't just conducting environmental research using artificial simulations. They were operating complete ecosystems that could support complex biological processes and generate environmental data that appeared to come from actual field sites around the world. The next few weeks followed a routine that included regular sublevel assignments twice per week, standard custodial duties on the upper floors, and ongoing observation of research activities that seemed increasingly complex and concerning. Dr. Martinez continued working late nights, but our interactions became more limited after our conversation about data inconsistencies. She appeared stressed and conflicted, but didn't approach me again with questions about my sublevel observations. I continued documenting what I observed, taking photographs when possible, and making notes about equipment, procedures, and research activities that seemed inconsistent with legitimate environmental research. But it was during my 6th week at Meridian that I encountered something that forced me to confront the possibility that I was involved in activities that went far beyond questionable data generation practices. I was working in Section 5 of SL2 during a regular sublevel assignment when I noticed that one of the complex environmental chambers appeared to be malfunctioning. The viewing window showed atmospheric effects that were more chaotic than the controlled weather patterns I'd observed during previous visits. I checked my protocols and found instructions for reporting equipment malfunctions in environmental chambers. I was supposed to document the problem and notify the research staff immediately so they could prevent damage to sensitive experimental conditions. I approached the viewing window to assess the nature of the malfunction and get a better view of what was happening inside the chamber. What I saw through that window changed my understanding of everything I'd observed during my work at Meridian. The chamber didn't contain a malfunctioning weather system. It contained what appeared to be a section of actual outdoor environment that was somehow being accessed or viewed from our underground location. Real terrain, real weather, real biological activity, not simulated, but actual. I was looking through the window at a landscape that existed somewhere else, viewed in real time through some kind of technology one couldn't understand. The atmospheric disturbance I'd interpreted as a malfunction was actually a storm system moving through an actual geographical location. I could see rain, wind effects, and lightning that were clearly natural weather phenomena rather than artificially generated atmospheric conditions. And in the distance, barely visible through the storm effects, I could see artificial structures that looked like monitoring equipment and communication devices. I was looking at an actual field site, viewed remotely through technology that made it appear as if the location was contained within an underground environmental chamber. I moved to other viewing windows and looked into the chambers I'd been cleaning around for weeks. Desert landscape that was actually a real location somewhere in an arid climate zone. Forest environment that was actually a real temperate ecosystem. mountain terrain that was actually a real geographical location with natural weather patterns and biological activity. Meridian wasn't generating artificial environmental data using sophisticated simulation chambers. They were accessing actual environmental locations through some kind of remote viewing technology and presenting the data as coming from conventional field monitoring stations. But that raised questions that were even more troubling than data fabrication. How was it possible to view actual geographical locations as if they were contained in underground chambers? What kind of technology could provide real-time access to remote environmental sites without conventional communication or monitoring equipment? And most importantly, if Meridian had access to advanced technology that could remotely monitor actual environmental conditions anywhere in the world, why were they concealing the nature of their capabilities and presenting their data as coming from conventional field research? If you want to know how this story ends and what I discovered next, hit that notification bell, because what I found in those chambers changed everything I thought I knew about reality itself. I spent the rest of my shift mechanically completing the cleaning routine, but my mind was racing with implications I couldn't fully process. When I signed out with Thomas at 7 a.m., I managed to act normally, but I knew I needed time to think about what I'd discovered. The technology Meridian possessed wasn't just advanced. It appeared to violate basic assumptions about how remote observation and data collection worked. Real-time access to actual locations without physical presence or conventional monitoring equipment suggested capabilities that went far beyond anything I understood to be possible. I drove home knowing that I'd stumbled into something much larger and more significant than questionable research practices. The enhanced compensation and confidentiality agreements suddenly made perfect sense. Meridian wasn't just protecting proprietary research methods. They were concealing technology that could fundamentally change how environmental monitoring and remote observation functioned. But I also knew that my curiosity had already carried me past the point where I could simply ignore what I discovered and focus on custodial duties. The questions raised by what I'd observed were too important to dismiss, even if pursuing answers meant risking the most stable employment I'd had in years. I parked in front of my apartment and sat in my truck for a few minutes, watching the morning sun reflect off windows of buildings that suddenly seemed less solid and reliable than they had the day before. If technology existed that could provide remote access to actual locations in ways that defied conventional understanding, then other assumptions about reality might be equally questionable. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, knowing that my next shift would force me to decide between financial security and answers to questions that seemed increasingly urgent to resolve.